This week on Inside Olympia, charting the decline of news sources in Washington state. What are the implications for civic discourse? What are the effects in urban, suburban, and rural Washington? And how can the trend be turned around? On the program, Professor Jennifer Henrichsen from Washington State University's Edward R. Murrow College of Communication.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Since 2005, the United States has lost a third of its newspapers. In Washington state, 2 counties lack any news outlet at all. The past 20 years have brought disruption, and some would say devastation, to the news industry. At the same time, trust in the media has plummeted. What are the implications of a shrunken and fractured media ecosystem? How does a decline in news affect democracy and civic discourse? What are the promising business models for the future? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is the author of a new report on the state of media in Washington, Jennifer Henrichsen, an assistant professor and research director at Washington State University's Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. Welcome to the program. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for making the trip clear across the state to Olympia. We were just talking about this a moment ago, but you actually covered the legislature for a session. Tell us a little bit about your background and experience actually covering the news.
Sure. Well, I was actually first an intern for the lobbyist Roland Thompson, and then
who is the lobbyist for the Allied Daily newspapers, the newspaper publishers?
Yes, and then the following year, I was the political correspondent for the Yakima Herald-Republic, and I was actually based on the west side, and I would commute down to Olympia to cover the legislature that session.
And just out of curiosity, were you headed down a road to have a career in journalism and then pivoted to academia, or what happened?
Well, I was very excited about the opportunity to do journalism, and I also had an opportunity to go abroad to Geneva, Switzerland, where I interned at the UN in the press corps there, and so I was able to write stories related to human rights issues and things like that. And so from there, I actually transitioned into more of an academic role. I went to University of Pennsylvania for my PhD. I did some work for UNESCO, writing reports about the state of global journalism, especially about safety and security of journalists. And now I'm at Washington State University.
Tell us a little bit about the impetus for this study, this report. What sparked it, and a little bit about the methodology.
Absolutely. So what sparked it was a decision among Murrow leadership that we needed to better understand the Washington State local news ecosystem, in part because the Washington State Legislature funded a program called the Murrow News Fellowship Program, which Washington State and Murrow College in particular administers, right? And so leadership said, you know what, it would be good to have a better sense of the state of affairs across Washington to make sure that we know where there are particular gaps, where there are underserved communities potentially, as we work to place journalists in news organizations to do civic affairs reporting.
So the idea was to have a little bit of data to drive maybe even decisions about how best to allocate the Murrow Fellows and how they could sort of have the most impact?
Yes, the idea was that we needed to have a better sense of the lay of the land in order to know where best to place journalists.
Okay, so that was sort of the need. Tell us what you set out to do and how you set out to do it.
Absolutely. So I was selected as the research director for the Washington Local News Project, and I ended up building up a team of different researchers to work on it with me, and we ended up doing lots of different types of methodologies. So we interviewed 32 civic leaders, journalists, and scholars about local news. We also did open source research, so we were looking around trying to figure out what sources exist in Washington. There's no one database, right? That would have made things a lot easier. And so instead, we were looking at a variety of different places to identify what are the sources, and then we had to identify what constitutes a source for the database. And so we had criteria to determine whether or not a local news organization could be in the database. And that meant 2 things. One, it had to be local, so it had to be physically based in Washington, or if on the margins of Washington, it had to be primarily oriented to a local community in Washington. And the second piece of that was content. So we wanted to make sure that what a news organization was producing locally relevant, recent, so timely work that was journalistic and original. So we developed this database. We had 2 coders look at all these sites to determine whether or not an outlet fit the criteria. And then we put together a survey and disseminated that to the 353 outlets that did meet the criteria to get more of an understanding of annual operating budget, staffing numbers, circulation, all sorts of things that are very difficult to find just doing open source data collection.
What kind of response did you get to those surveys?
We had a pretty good response, actually. I think it was in the 40% or so, which is pretty good for surveys these days. But we did spend a lot of effort on the survey. So not only did we do an online survey, we had phone survey follow-ups. So we were trying to get as many outlets to respond as possible. And that was pretty time intensive.
There, on this program in the last couple of years, we have had the League of Women Voters on to talk about a study that they did about the local news environment in the state. Matt Powers, professor at University of Washington School of Communication, was on recently to talk about his report with colleagues on the state of declining Capitol press corps. What help us sort of put your study in context for the fact that a lot of people have been, or increasingly people are looking at this issue and this problem. How did you see this study fitting into what others have looked at?
So the League of Women Voters did a great report that was published, I believe, in 2022, and they primarily focused on newspapers. And so we did look at their data, we looked at their report, and we wanted to expand upon that. So our report focuses not only on newspapers, but also TV stations, radio, online-only outlets, magazines, and newspapers.
You were casting a pretty wide net.
Very wide net,
Yeah.
yes. And so we were searching high and low for different types of sources of news across the state. And as you said, Matt Powers' report was more focused specifically on state capitol reporting. So ours is more of a 30,000-foot view, I would say, of the state, and it's a constantly changing state of affairs, right, with local news. But it basically is trying to be the most comprehensive to date to looking at how the ecosystem is operating.
And why, I mean, you described sort of doing this in the context of the Murrow Fellows Program, which is all about seeding newsrooms that have had contraction and trying to get boots on the ground, especially in underserved communities. But beyond that, why is it important in 2025 to get a handle on this? Why should we care? For that matter, a lot of people in this country don't like reporters and don't think they can trust journalism, so they might think it's a really good thing that newspapers are shriveling up and floating off, into the, never to be seen again land. Why should we care?
We should care for a number of reasons. One, we are in a crisis of local news across the nation, and Washington is also in a local news crisis, as identified by the report that we put out. We also know that local news is really important for civic life, specifically for civic engagement. We know that when a local newspaper closes, it's less likely that citizens in that area are turning out to vote, for example. We also know that local news helps reduce political polarization, and that's increasingly on the rise, it seems, across the U.S. And we need local news in order to bring us together, in order to have us have a nonpartisan identity, a more cross-cutting affiliation with one another, so we can actually engage in dialogue about a variety of issues as we go about our lives.
And you're making a distinction between local news and national news. But I don't think that distinction is always made. News is news to a lot of people.
Yes.
Why do you say these things about local news and maybe not necessarily about national news, or would you?
Well, national news is doing better in general than local news as it relates to finances, I would say. Local news specifically tends to focus on issues that are important to the communities. So you want to have news related to local government, you want to have news related to school boards, and other aspects that people need access to in order to know who to vote for, know how to get involved if they disagree with a policy, for example. They need to know if their school is going to close for their children, things like that.
Do you have a sense, either empirically or just a gut check, about how much the polarization we're seeing in this country is a result of social media, sort of more partisan national news sources, the business models changing maybe to incentivize partisanship, as compared to the decline of local news and sort of what it fosters positively from a civic discourse standpoint. Does that make sense? Is it, to what extent is our polarization a result of declining local news sources versus a bunch of things that are out of our control and maybe happening at a national level?
Well, what we do know from scholarship is that when local news declines or goes away, it's filled by national news or social media. And we also know that national news, as well as social media content, tends to be more divisive. It tends to be more polarized. It tends to be more dichotomous. And so individuals, when they read the national news, they're identifying more strongly with particular partisan identities. Whereas at the local level, what you see instead is when individuals are covering your community, you might be reading news about high school sports one day and then the local government the next day. And so there's a way in which to operate in the world that's not all about partisan identity. And so you really need that connection to local news to have a better sense of your community and also to have a better sense of sort of social cohesion.
So let's talk about what you found. And I know that there are 2 counties in this state that lack a news source at all. I think 5 of our 39 counties have just one identified news source. But as you cast this net, as you try to include more entities than exclude, so you were looking pretty expansively, what picture emerged? Is it fair to say that we are in a crisis when it comes to local news, or is it a more nuanced picture?
I think it is a nuanced picture, but I also think it's fair to say that we're in a crisis of local news. So I did find, or our team found, 2 counties that have no local news outlet, which means that fit our criteria in our database, which means that they're classified as a news desert. And so individuals in those counties don't have easy access to local news, and that may increase political polarization, right? Because they may need to fill the gap in local news with other sources. And it's not like you go online and are able to find a bunch of local news in that particular county. Right. Yeah. Instead, you find national news about something completely different, potentially.
We should just note that it's Ferry County and what's the other one? And Skamania County are the 2.
Right, and as you noted, 5 other counties had 1 outlet. So it's precarious. It's a precarious situation facing journalism, facing local news across the state. And so we did find news deserts in more rural areas, but there's also precarity facing more urban areas as well.
And what does that look like? Because we tend to think of the urban, especially west side counties being perhaps better served. I mean, there's TV stations, there are still newspapers, there's startup online only publications. Where do you think more urban and suburban Puget Sound region citizens are being underserved?
And served is a tricky term in some ways. So when we say served or underserved, we don't mean any motivation, right, within that. Yeah. It's more the ability of outlets to exist in order to...
The menu of what's available.
Exactly. And so what we did find when we adjusted for population, we found some regions and some counties on the west side of the state that were less populated with outlets than you might think. Right, but that was when adjusted for population. And so South Puget Sound rose to one of the top of areas that need maybe more infrastructure or more resources, as an example.
The thing that I think so many people notice and identify is maybe in some communities they've seen their local newspaper go away, but in most other places what they've seen is their local newspaper shrink. And what I think confounds people is, well, life is more complicated, the world is more complicated, and the newspaper is getting thinner by the day. And oh, by the way, maybe it's not being delivered or even printed 5 days a week anymore. And by the way, I am paying a lot more than I used to for much less. And then people start to make the value proposition, is it even worth subscribing to my local newspaper?
Yes.
So help us unpack some of that.
Well, that's a big problem, right? And I hear that anecdotally all the time with my relatives, for example. But what you do have happening is as news organizations shrink, they have to lay off staff, when you lay off staff, you have less depth of reporting, also typically less breadth. So then you're relying on articles from other organizations potentially to fill the paper. And
those
such,
might not even be local stories.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
then oftentimes they're not
Right.
local. And so then the individual who is subscribing to the outlet says, I don't even know if this is worth it because it's not covering my community. It's a lot less dense than it used to be. I'm not actually getting the news that I'm wanting. So why should I pay for it?
And I
actually,
could find this elsewhere.
Yes. And I mean, the pay structure is a big challenge, of course, as we know, facing local news. But there's also a situation where a lot of research has focused on the supply side of the local news crisis, looking at, which rightly so, right? So looking at, well, what resources do news organizations need? How do we increase employment within news organizations? At the same time, there needs to be research or more research potentially done on the audience side, needing to understand what is the demand for local news? What specifically do these communities really want to know about so we can reach our audiences where they are and so that they will see the value of our local paper and they will subscribe and they'll, support us sort of in perpetuity.
How much is the medium important here? I do feel like there are legacy newspaper readers and subscribers who still like to get the printed newspaper. And for a moment, we're going to talk about newspapers, but obviously there, as you noted, this study looks at not just newspapers. But the younger generation is much more comfortable and interested in reading digitally and on their device. And, I'm not sure my kids have ever picked up a newspaper, I'm sad to say. But that's because they're, digital natives like to use their phones. So do you have any thoughts about whether it matters how you're getting your news? If we want to support local news and local newspapers, do we actually have to have a physical printed newspaper, or is a digital only publication fine? And the reason I ask is because people will point to the fact that many newspapers have reduced their print schedules or stopped delivering or whatever it is as a sign of troubled times.
Well, I think it's complicated, and I think it also depends on what audiences you're trying to reach. So, as you say, digital natives, right, are more likely to want digital product and they don't necessarily need that printed version. At the same time, you need to understand where your audiences are accessing the news. Are they opening your newsletter? Are they accessing the website? Are they getting that printed version, right? Really trying to be expansive as much as you can to reach the audiences that want to subscribe, for example, to the newspaper, while at the same time understanding the economic reality facing a lot of news organizations, which in turn, as you mentioned, has resulted in them reducing printing costs, for example. But age is an interesting aspect here, because if I think about my classes, I teach journalism students, and they're the young generation, right? And I ask them, I usually have a survey early on in the class, and I say, how do you get your news? And a lot of them want to be journalists, and I hear, I get it from social media sites or things like that. And I challenge them to subscribe to news outlets, and a lot of them do. And so I say, and if you want to be in this business, you need to understand what's being written, what's being produced. You need to understand what's out there in the world, how to do it, and you need to consume it in order to have a better understanding of that. And they do tend to subscribe, so that's nice.
Yeah, you're making incremental change, student by student. But I want to pause for a moment on this idea of getting your news from social media, because I think it's worth interrogating even what that means. How do you, when you hear somebody say that, do you think it means that they're scrolling social media and somehow conflating news with whatever is showing up in their feed? Do you think it means that they're seeing articles linked there and clicking through to them, and then that's how they get their news? What does it mean when we get our news via social media?
So it also depends. So I ask in the survey that I give to my students, which particular distribution channels do you access, right? And a lot of what I see is TikTok or Twitter/X, not as much with that one anymore. And so in those cases, it's not necessarily the news organization distributing its content, but rather other posts from other people.
Or it could be an influencer.
Exactly.
Who's doing
But what
something.
we also talk about is sources, right? And understanding where you're getting your information, whether or not it's factual, how do you make sure it's verifiable, and all of that really important journalistic knowledge.
The other thing that it seems like with the digital sort of first approach is that you have to be pretty intentional to find local news on your device. Perhaps you subscribe, the Seattle Times has an app, so subscribers usually probably have that, and I think a larger newspaper can maybe draw an audience that way. But if you're going to social media, if you're just going online, going to YouTube, going to TikTok, chances are the news content you're getting is not going to be from your hometown.
That's true, yes. That's a big problem.
And so for local news providers trying to figure out if they're transitioning away from the printed newspaper to digital, how do you reach those audiences?
And that's why audience metrics are so important. And I read a statistic the other day talking about how smaller organizations in particular, like those that have $250,000 or less of an annual operating budget.
Which is most.
Yes, tend to, and this is a study that was done, not that I didn't do it, but tend to not engage with audience metrics. And so you do have to engage in some capacity to understand where are people accessing the information, what do they want to see more about, and how can you fit that need to an extent so they see the value proposition.
I want to just pull a couple more stats from this study. So of 1,092 initial outlets that were identified, only 353 produce original, locally relevant news. As we noted, Skamania and Ferry counties lack any outlets at all. Rural and frontier areas like Wahkiakum County have higher outlets per capita than urban counties like Clark. Newspapers do still dominate the landscape, but are followed by online-only outlets and radio. By the way, fewer than half the newspapers are publishing daily, I think your report found. So when you sort of see declining newspapers, perhaps increasing online opportunities, I don't know what's happening sort of in the radio-only news outlet, if that's flat, up or down. But if you were starting to think about rebuilding a healthy local ecosystem, what would that mix look like, do you think, in the 21st century? What would be the elements, given the financial realities and audience challenges?
In terms of medium?
Yeah, and just or mediums. What would the blend look like? If we were to try to, let's say, do a case study in a county like Ferry County that doesn't have any news source left, do you have any thoughts on like what if somebody wanted to replace what I imagine was at one time a local newspaper there? What the best way to do that would be?
That's a very good question. And I think it varies depending on the county, the types of resources that county might have. Is it more rural? Will there be possibilities for infrastructure? Will philanthropy want to invest? Is that a good opportunity for maybe a nonprofit to set its sights on helping out in that case? It really does depend on the local environment. And so I don't want to say, one size fits all, because obviously counties are very different. But I think it needs to be multi-pronged. And I think that there is a lot of energy around nonprofit news. There are more nonprofit news organizations developing. There's a lot of philanthropic interest in supporting them. Sometimes nonprofits have more flexibility to engage in creative news gathering because maybe their financials are a little bit more secured for a bit. And so there's a lot of energy in that space. So perhaps that's one opportunity.
Let me ask the question this way. Based on what we're seeing nationally in terms of local news sort of bright spots, do you have a sense of whether a traditional printed newspaper, whether that's a daily or even a weekly or a monthly, versus a digital-only site makes more sense in this day and age?
I mean, I would lean toward digital, just because so many people are accessing information through digital means. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. And so, for example, I know Cal Matters just connected with the Markup, and so they merged, and they're trying to reach, a broader audience with more financial sustainability. So perhaps there needs to be more collaborations across medium as well.
By the way, Cal Matters is a nonprofit newsroom in California.
Right.
Just before we go to break, let me ask you about a recent case study, which is the Spokesman Review family, the Coles family in Spokane, deciding to turn their newspaper over to a nonprofit. I think they're going to seed that with a couple $1 million. But this is a dynasty newspaper family on the east side of the state. And it would appear, at least from the outside, that they're kind of throwing up their hands and saying, we just can't run this as a for-profit entity anymore. But we also don't want it to to wither and die. So we're going to try to do this Hail Mary and turn it into a nonprofit. What do you make of the? I mean, this is kind of a fascinating case study. I'm not sure I've seen it before. What do you? And you're over on that side of the mountains. What do you?
I am.
What do you
South,
think?
though.
South, yes. But what are you thinking of this?
Well, I mean, I think that they've thought long and hard about doing this for a number of years, and I think that they believe it's in their best interest. It's the most sustainable option on the table to do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So I think they do see the energy. They do see positive examples of nonprofits doing good work and being able to sustain themselves long term. But of course, it's not a silver bullet. You can't just change into a nonprofit organization and everything's going to be fine. You have to diversify your revenue sources. You have to make sure that you're getting major gifts, but you also have to get maybe direct donations. You have to get subscribers, right? There's lots of different aspects to make sure that the financial model is sustainable long term. So I know that it's something that they've thought about for a long time, and I'm sure that they're doing it with the best intentions. And so we'll see.
Would you be willing to wager on whether you think this is going to be successful?
I think that you have a lot of smart people who care deeply about journalism who are doing this, so I think it has every likelihood of being successful. I also think, so when we talk about local news, we often are down about it, right? Which there's good reason to be concerned. And at the same time, you have to have active hope. You have to be willing to try new things, have entrepreneurial energy, believe that something is possible, and then make change as you see fit.
Okay. We'll take a brief break. When we return, we continue our conversation with Professor Jennifer Henrichsen on the state of media in Washington State. Back right after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Just hit another vehicle.
With the current pursuit law, you could literally have someone steal a vehicle and drive through a school zone actively at 100 miles an hour back and forth, and no one will be able to do anything about that.
Passing by school.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Washington State University Professor Jennifer Henrichsen, the author of a recent report on the state of the media in Washington. And I want to note that this report, and we've talked a little bit and touched on this, that when you lose local media, you talked about losing information that can kind of connect people, that can help them find common ground beyond just politics. But, and you mentioned lower voter turnout, other sort of results of less local news, lower civic knowledge, reduced public accountability is a big one, because if you don't have a local newspaper going to those school board meetings, going to those city council meetings, maybe making a public records request or two, digging into what the local police chief is doing. Waste, fraud, and abuse, corruption people can get away with it. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit to sort of that, besides just the news you need to know, maybe to go through your day, the importance of having journalists and communities to hold public officials accountable?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the fundamental roles of journalism is to hold people in power and powerful interests to account, to be that sort of watchdog role, and that can happen at the local level as well as the national level. And so even having a journalist in the room at a committee hearing, for example, it might make a political leader sit up a little straighter and make sure that they are more aware of what they're saying or what they're doing, and making sure that they are representing the interests of the community that they say that they're going to serve. So even just having the physical presence of a journalist in the room, in many cases, can increase that accountability.
And that can be a form of accountability for the taxpayer, for the voter, for the citizen. They don't have the time to go to these meetings. Mm-hmm. They don't have time to dig through the records. Some of my favorite stories when the Pulitzer Prizes come out are about the little engines that the little newspapers that dug into some corrupt public official and exposed something and did so in a shoestring, and then end up winning a Pulitzer, without having the resources of something like the New York Times or ProPublica. And that happens from time to time, and it's pretty inspiring. So it also feels like sometimes it's a one step forward, two steps back kind of scenario. So let's go back to the Murrow Fellows program, which was created by the legislature. It was sort of a legacy project of Senator Karen Kaiser, who started her career as a television journalist. And now the state is in the first class of fellows cohort was in place this year. And some of them were in the Capitol, covering the Capitol, others in newsrooms around the state. But now the state's in a budget crisis, and so funding has been reduced, I think, by half. And now there's a question about whether the program can continue, and if so, will it be half of what it is today? So gosh, we just got this going, and now it might be in jeopardy. What are your thoughts on what this tells us about the ongoing challenge of trying to do local news and fund it?
Well,
I mean, we hardly got this thing off the ground.
Well,
it's already been chopped.
Over.
It's not over.
Okay. I mean, the intention is that it continues.
And I know they can come back in the supplemental budget
yes, and that
next
is
year.
the goal.
Yeah.
And I know that the leadership is already looking at, opportunities for diversifying funding if necessary. But the hope is, of course, that next legislative session there'll be more funding allotted for it, because there have been 16 fellows in the field. They produced more than 1,300 stories in the first year. And that work is also available via Creative Commons, which is really helpful for other outlets across the state, because they can run those stories in their own outlets with, a proper attribution.
So free to use.
Yes, exactly. So it's really valuable service that those journalists are doing. I think your question was, how does this reflect on the state of local news? I mean, I think what you see in California is similar budget cutting mechanisms and how that may impact local news in that state. At the same time, you could argue that local news is a worthwhile investment regardless of the budget situation. And in many ways, legislators have said this, civic leaders have said this, it really needs to be viewed as a public good. It needs to be viewed as infrastructure, such as we think about the roads we travel on or the water that we drink. It's so important to having a sense of what is going on in our society, what's going on in our communities. How do we make sure that we are keeping our government leaders accountable? How do we make sure that our schools stay open? So in some ways, it's even more important to fund it in a crisis like we're seeing fiscally.
Do you think the public believes that in this day and age?
I think some members of the public do. The but a good thing is local news tends to be more trusted than national news. And so that is a great opening, I would say, for local news to develop more strongly in the state. And there are a lot of reasons for why people are more likely to trust local news. I have to believe in some cases it's because you might know the journalist in your community. Right. Maybe they're also the coach of your kids' soccer team, for example. And so there's less of this us versus them mentality that can be popularized in national media because you actually know who that journalist is and what their contribution is in society.
There are a lot of people trying to think about the business models and the funding mechanisms to rebuild local news, and it includes obviously public financing, which is not something that there's a huge tradition of that in other countries. I don't know that there's such a tradition of it here, but we're starting to see examples of that, California, now Washington. There's also talk of trying to tax or otherwise make big tech pay, because the argument is that the Googles of the world and the Metas of the world and the algorithms on social media are sort of hoovering this stuff up, monetizing it, getting the ad dollars. Maybe the newspaper or the news site is getting the click, maybe they're not, but they're not getting much of any of the ad revenue. Canada and Australia have tried to make big tech pay, and I think in Canada at least Meta just stopped allowing news onto its platform there. What are your thoughts on that specific concept of trying to get tech companies to somehow pay back into a system that would then fund local journalism?
I think it's a great idea, in part because local news, as well as other forms of news, are often distributed on those platforms, and news organizations do not get the dollars that they should for their news to be distributed in that way. And so this past legislative session, there was SB 5400, which was looking at how to have big tech companies basically pay a little bit more into a fund to then establish a newsroom journalism core. And I think that is a terrific idea, and it could be complementary to something like the Murrow News Fellowship Program, where you're having more money from big organizations that might not even notice it being, taken for local news.
Potentially trillion-dollar companies.
Yes,
Who
huge,
might be helping
huge.
seed newsrooms that are running on like $250,000
Yes,
a year.
exactly. And so you're going to help broaden and deepen the infrastructure for those local news organizations, while also through the Monroe News Fellowship Program, you're having staff populate those outlets. And so they could work together in a really nice way. And in many ways, everyone benefits, society benefits when local news is bolstered, right? We know that it reduces political polarization, it increases relates to increased civic engagement and civic information. And so if we talk a big game, I feel like, about living in a democracy. So we actually have to make sure that we create the infrastructure so that democracy survives.
But we also know these companies will fight mandates. What ended up happening in California is they essentially cut a deal on the side and didn't end up passing a bill. And Google has agreed to now pay into a fund, but it's voluntary. It's binding, but it's voluntary. The state was going to put in money. Now that's being cut because of the budget situation there. And as I noted, in Canada, where Meta was being forced to do this, Meta just said, well, we're not going to allow news links to appear on our feeds anymore, which then undermines the whole purpose, right? I mean, so do you have a thought on a carrot versus stick approach on passing laws and sort of taxing these companies versus what California's tried to do with more of an agreement?
Well, I'm not a legislator.
Yes.
I'm an academic.
Right, and maybe that's a good thing because this is complicated stuff. I don't envy the policymakers trying to figure this out.
Right. I mean, I do think that if you're going to get legislation passed to encourage this development, the companies have to see a benefit. And so I encourage that benefit to be more obvious in order for things to move forward.
What are some other ways of doing this? Have you seen other ideas from around the country or around the world? Yeah, you mentioned foundations, you mentioned grants. Somebody said to me recently, look, if it's a nonprofit, it likely has a deep-pocketed donor, and we've seen this. Wealthy individuals who have said, I believe that we need to rebuild news, so I'm going to put my own money into it and not even have an expectation necessarily of a profit. And I'm not talking about Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. I'm talking about people starting, for the most part, nonprofit news sites. But oftentimes those individuals do have their own agenda. They have their own political sort of, predilections. And then, the question becomes, well, can you trust it if some billionaire is behind it? So I'm curious, again, sort of this broader question of what other models there are, but then they all sort of seem to have potential flaws. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it's public money, taxpayer money, do we really want the government? Does that sort of thin the wall between the journalists and government? If it's a billionaire, what is their agenda? If it's a foundation, what do they want to get out of it?
I mean, I think there are ways in which to funnel money into local journalism that doesn't change the editorial content that those journalists produce. I think that's absolutely fundamentally important, and I think we see that being done. So it's absolutely possible. I think it's smart to be aware and cautious, right, of potential interests or undue influence. But at the same time, the mechanism for setting it up can increase that firewall, right? It can make sure that the editorial content isn't being changed as a result of where the money is coming from. I do think that's possible. In terms of diversifying or making sure that more models are sustainable, one thing that came up in the interviews is the increased need and actual desire and action toward collaboration. It sounds maybe flippant, I don't mean it that way, but we see more news organizations partnering with external news organizations to write and produce stories that they wouldn't normally be able to do.
And an example would be, a classic example would be working with ProPublica to do investigative work. Mm-hmm. And while ProPublica works with national news organizations, they also partner with local news sites.
Absolutely. Another option or thought is in Ohio, there's something called Signal Ohio, and it's like a statewide organization, news organization, and then it has teams of journalists in different cities around Ohio that are producing important local news for their communities.
But it's a statewide service,
it's
part of a broader, so it's not It's not just one little community, it's trying to have a network.
Right, but you are still getting at the local aspect because you have journalists embedded in those areas.
In those communities,
which is incredibly important, also for trust, like we talked about a little bit before.
As you noted, I mean, things aren't exactly easy at the national level, and we do see layoffs regularly, and then we also see large city newspapers laying people off. LA Times has had contractions recently. But do you see any opportunities or models to do at a local level to have a for-profit model anymore? Or do you think that those days are gone and we really need to be almost exclusively looking, at least, again, at the local and regional level, at nonprofit journalism? Do you think anybody can make money doing this?
I think yes, but I think we need to know more about the audiences that we say we are serving, right? So we need to engage more in analytics. We need to have a better understanding of how people are accessing the information. What are they super interested in? Maybe even bringing local community members into an editorial meeting to comment on what they think hasn't been covered, that they would really like to know about. Right? So making the case to the audiences that it's something that they need to buy, it's something that they need to support because they see the value add for it.
You mentioned the surveys a moment ago, and I'm interested to know what you heard and what your colleagues heard when you were talking to these news organizations and talking to their leadership. What was the narrative that emerged? What kind of optimism or pessimism did you hear? We saw, I'll give you the example of the Everett Herald being bought out, and then there were subsequently layoffs, and a lot of sort of anger and acrimony about the way that was handled, and sort of this sense that this is what happens, right? There's this group of newspapers, and they're sort of about to collapse, and somebody comes in, and it seems like maybe the rescue has arrived, but then it turns out badly, and that builds and sort of feeds this cynicism. But as you were calling around and talking to people, what was the general mood?
Well, just on that point first, it depends on who buys you, right? So in that case, a national chain, Carpenter Media, bought Sound Publishing's, collection of papers, and it did result in layoffs. And what we've also seen more generally is when a national chain buys outlets, you typically see layoffs. You see less coverage, you see less in-depth coverage, and it's a problem for the outlet, in part because maybe that chain uses other content from its other partners. Maybe it views itself as having a national audience, even though it's a locally based paper that it's bought. And so you have a decimation of local news in those cases.
And we should, just to not lose that thread, one of the frustrations people feel, I was speaking to a group recently, and somebody raised this in the audience, what about hedge funds buying out newspapers? It's not, it used to be, locally owned, and then it was maybe regionally owned, and then maybe there were some national companies that were buying up newspapers, again, because of scales of economy. But now you literally have Wall Street sometimes doing this. And the sense of sort of obligation to the local community, if it exists at all, is very thin. So can you speak just to that trend line?
Well, that is something that's very worrying, that scholars have noted that when a hedge fund buys news outlets, it usually results in a decimation, right? So the staff get laid off. It's a collapse of the types of local coverage. It doesn't speak to the local community anymore because the goal, it seems, is to maximize profits versus embed basically in the local community and serve the people. But you also asked about bright spots related to...
Yeah, so let's go back to what
let's talk about bright spots.
Yeah, well, what the survey showed when you talked to people.
So we did interviews with civic leaders, journalists, and scholars, and then the survey was focused more on particular attributes like annual operating budget, staffing numbers, and things like that. And I will say that the interviews were both positive and negative in that individuals we talked to have real concerns, right, about the state of local news. Everybody agreed that it's in a state of crisis. They used different words to describe it, but that was the overall sentiment from every single person we spoke to. But at the same time, we saw individuals talk about the importance of collaboration among journalists, also among news organizations, diversifying revenue streams, making sure that not only are you asking for subscription dollars, but you're getting major gifts or other forms of community engagement, right, in order to have events or some sort of thing to bring in the community members who then see the value of journalism and then maybe subscribe, for example.
It has to be much more of a two-way street.
Yes, it definitely needs to be more two-way, absolutely, yeah.
Did you, overall, would you say that there was a sense of optimism or pessimism about the future? Could you glean that?
I think it depended on which aspect we were talking about, actually. So when we talked about journalists and the journalism pipeline, well, that was actually positive and negative, but people recommitted to the idea that journalism is a vocation, that there's really hardworking journalists out there, that the value of journalism is clear to those in the business, and it's clear to some civic leaders and legislators, but there was also an understanding that journalism has a, quote, PR problem, in that we're not communicating the value of journalism more broadly to members of society who need to understand the value in order to be more engaged with it.
I don't want to give, so I want to talk about the pipeline because I think that that's really important. I also don't want to give short shrift, although we already have, to television and radio. So let me ask you about that first. What is the role, as you see it, of the broadcasters in a state like Washington? Again, in an era of consolidation, national media companies buying up a lot of these stations that used to be locally owned. Not always, but that's often the trend line. And all of those stations are working with fewer resources than they used to. What's your analysis of the role of broadcasters in the local news ecosystem, how that's evolving and changing?
Mm-hmm. I think broadcast is also experiencing a lot of the same challenges that we're seeing in other areas like print and online journalism, where news organizations are having to do more with less, and how that has an impact on the types of coverage that are being undertaken and the depth of that coverage. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that they're so different. Instead, we're facing sort of a writ large crisis,
right,
where finances in particular are incredibly hard to come by.
And going back to your point about what the audience needs and wants, and then the research, the broadcasters are also losing audience as the media ecosystem fractures and there are more choices and people can find stuff digitally. And and then if fewer people are watching, then that means less revenue. And then it sort of feeds the vicious cycle.
Which gets us back to the audience side and how important it is for audiences to understand the value of journalism.
So what would you, if you were speaking to, let's say, you mentioned having interned with Roland Thompson, he represents the news publishers. Let's say Roland brings you in to speak to the news publishers of Washington State based on the research you've done. And you've come back to this idea of audience research a number of times. What would be your key message to them?
In terms of what?
What you've learned and what they can learn from you, and what maybe they should be doing more of or better or differently.
Well, I think that what the research has shown is that we're in a local news crisis, that we're still trying to figure out viable funding models, that there's not one financial strategy, right? That there needs to be a diversification of revenue, that there needs to be more research done both on the news organization side as well as maybe in the scholarship world, looking at audience metrics, understanding what audiences want, understanding how do you make sure that you can get people to commit to your particular organization and fund it in some capacity.
Would you be telling them that they need to be working better together?
I don't want to say specifically that, but I mean, it does seem like collaboration is a way forward through this crisis, and that did come up in the interviews quite a bit, actually. And you can even see collaboration as important for the journalistic pipeline. So we did ask individuals about that, and there are different ways in which to improve the journalistic pipeline through collaboration, such as maybe a university partners with a National Journalism Association, or maybe you make sure that journalism students at your university are aware of the New York Times core program, where if you're a junior or sophomore or freshman, you can apply to this program and get guidance from people in the news industry.
What is so? And that I want to stick on the pipeline issue for a moment, because the other issue is if young people coming up into the into college and looking at what to major in and looking at careers, see a blighted landscape in the news business, and particularly the local news business. Their parents are probably not going to be that thrilled if they're majoring in journalism. They may look at it as not a great bet, and maybe they're going to go then, do public relations or something. You're teaching the next generation. You're in an academic environment, and the Murrow School obviously is, it is our journalism, our flagship journalism program among the public institutions in this state, notwithstanding the School of Communication at UW. I'm a proud graduate, or PLU's, and you're a graduate of PLU, has journalism as well. But what is your thinking about getting people to get into this business and commit?
Well, I think people want to be in the business. You see that. I have full classes, and they're all journalism majors. They're very excited. So that's pretty exciting for me as a professor as well. Journalism is very much a vocation. It's a calling for a lot of people. Where else can you write and learn in such a fast-paced environment and actually do some good for society, right? It's a really important profession. And so I would say that the individuals who go through my classes, they can avail themselves of multiple opportunities. We have a rural plunge program, a rural reporting project that Lisa Wannanen-Jones, a professor at Murrow, runs. So they get hands-on opportunity to engage with rural communities and report about really important issues. There's a backpack journalism program where students every year go to a different country and report on the ground, and they get their pieces published in top places. And then, of course, the Murrow News Fellowship Program, too. It's taking early career journalists and placing them in news outlets where they get great on-the-ground experience. They're publishing frequently. They're seeing their work picked up by multiple agencies. They're filling a deep need that the state of Washington has. So I think there's multiple opportunities to be successful in journalism despite the financial picture.
And when you think about, those are great examples, but just the fact that the business, at least at the local level, doesn't pay well. The health insurance isn't that great. The retirement package, if we know how, the cost of living is so high. It seems like, kind of realistically, if you're going to do this, you need to have a second job, or you need to have a partner or a spouse who has a more remunerative job. Can you really make a living in local news these days? The trend lines I see are pretty worrisome in that sense. And that's why I feel like so many people get out of it. Either don't go into it or exit around the time they're like, well, I might like to have a family, or I might like to buy a house, and this just isn't going to get me there.
That's absolutely an issue, right? And we actually heard that in our interviews, where sometimes the journalists really cared about their work, and then they just couldn't make it financially. They couldn't live where they were reporting from.
Right.
They had to commute, so there's not that connection with the community, which in turn, affects trust potentially. So it's absolutely an issue, and that's again why the Murrow News Fellowship Program is so valuable in many ways, because it provides a good wage for early career journalists to practice the craft of journalism.
And they also get benefits.
They do.
They get
Yes,
healthcare,
they get benefits. Yes.
Just before we have to go, it's my favorite last question, or second to last question. What about AI and the role of AI in this? Is there any hope that AI could help with local news, or is it the enemy?
Well, it's not a dichotomy. So I would say that there are ways in which to utilize artificial intelligence to streamline news gathering processes. But at the same time, you have to be very cautious with how you use it to make sure that you're not undermining the practice of journalism. So, for example, we know that artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, is not necessarily the best at sources. Right. So it has these things called hallucinations, where it's not actual facts. So I'm more of the mindset that if you are planning to use AI in the newsroom, you should have an ethical code around it, those are being developed in many places around the world. And you should do so in a way that does not undermine trust or credibility in the news. So maybe streamline aspects that are already human created, but don't use it for the content creation, obviously.
One potentially worrying trend, though, is some are starting to use it for content creation and in lieu of a human reporter. In 30 seconds, where do you see this research going from here? What are the next steps? What do you want to look at next?
So what I want to look at next is actually through the Carnegie Fellowship that I received.
Congratulations,
Thank you so
by the
much.
way.
Thank you. And I'm very interested in assessing the Murrow News Fellowship program. So specifically looking at how that program, that's state-led in many ways, can be potentially replicated, because I think it will encourage civic engagement and reduce political polarization. So I have multiple stages to the work, but that's essentially what I'm looking at to see in what ways can it do that.
Okay, we'll be looking forward to that. Dr. Jennifer Henrichsen, the Assistant Professor and Research Director at Washington State University's Edward R. Murrow College of Communication, and the lead author on this study looking at the local news ecosystem in Washington State. Thanks so much for coming in. Thanks for making the trip over.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.